Okay, let me begin with a couple of very brief announcements. The first is a reminder that we have a makeup class this Saturday. Rain, sunshine, whatever the situation may be, we're going to meet at the Fowler at 12 o'clock. And I also want to add that this will be an opportunity for an open discussion. So if you have any questions during those 2 hours, while we're in the museum, and particularly the second hour when we're outside, if it's raining, we'll be in a classroom, but particularly during the second hour, you should feel free to pose any questions, because I will lecture, but I don't have to. I mean, if you all of you have a number of questions that you want to raise, that would be an opportunity for you to ask me those questions. And secondly, this Friday, immediately after class, if there are a couple of you, a few students here, or many of you who want to join me for lunch, for an informal lunch, we can just go buy lunch at Ackerman and have a conversation there. So instead of meeting me in my office, because of course my office hours are Monday and Wednesdays, but I'm happy to make myself available for an informal conversation on Friday, and it doesn't have to be confined to class matters. It could be on politics or anything else that interests you. All right. So what I want to do today is I want to begin with a few thoughts which I had already shared with you, and I want to sort of bring that discussion to a conclusion. And these were thoughts on lighting. Recall that the context here was we were looking at 19th century technologies. And the nature of these technologies varies considerably. I mean, usually when people study technologies, they look at such things as telegraph, the railways. Those would be the more commonly studied forms of technology in the 19th century. But as I've suggested to you, and of course I spoke about the railways a bit, but as I've suggested to you that there are other kinds of technologies that one can look at. So the two that we've been looking at were the machine gun and the industrialization of light in the 19th century. So let me add a few more thoughts about lighting, and also have you keep in mind, of course, that there was another aspect of technologies that we've spoken about, and that is what I described as technologies of the state, which included such things as surveillance and the setting up of archives and so on. All right. So what you have is that, as we move into the 19th century, lighting is going to become industrialized. Before, lighting used to be mainly through solitary lanterns. There's this wonderful film, which I recommend, by Stanley Kubrick. Some of you may be familiar with Stanley Kubrick as the person who made the great film on 2001: A Space Odyssey. Some of you may have seen A Clockwork Orange or Dr. Strangelove. But he also made a film called Barry Lyndon, which is a film which really looks at lighting. And his use of lighting is absolutely superb there. Because he's looking at the 18th century, and he's really experimenting with the whole idea of lighting as well in this particular film, although that's not the primary subject of the film. But in any case, in the 19th century, it becomes possible for the first time to speak of what we might describe as a sea of light, right? So that rather than just having individual lanterns, that you can now actually have industrialized lighting. And of course, the traditional forms of gas lighting used either propane or butane, methane, and so on. And these are going to be replaced initially by arc lights. So if you read that chapter that was assigned to you, that one of the arguments that is advanced there is that the aim of this public lighting, particularly in the 1880s, and he actually has a quotation from a writer at that time, was to make it possible that one could read a newspaper at all times and see the flies on the walls of houses. I thought that was exceedingly amusing, but of course what he's talking about is the fact that everything becomes visible now in a way that was not really visible before, right? And if you go through that particular chapter that was assigned to you, he describes how lighting would inundate a whole area and describes these light towers. So initially it was these light towers, and then by the late 19th century and the early 20th century, we begin to move to even more centralized forms of lighting. All right. Now, what I'm interested in are a couple of aspects. I mean, one of which I had sort of hinted at in my concluding remarks to you on Monday, when I pointed out to you that that there has been the use of lighting, for example, for all kinds of purposes, such as the fact that if you look at prisoners, one of the ways in which they have often been tortured is that you shine lights on them all the time. And the argument I was making there was, of course, a different argument, because I was suggesting to you that sleep is one frontier which has not been completely colonized yet, although there are, if I may put it this way, people who are working at colonizing sleep as well. But my interest there was principally really the following, all right? That is the elimination of the idea of darkness. And of course, now we have to start thinking metaphorically as well. So in other words, now when we look at this technology, we're not only talking about the fact that it's making light available all the time. What happens, for example, I mean, how have our reading habits changed, let's say, over the course of the last 150 years, particularly the last 100 years when lighting became available? I mean, I suspect that when we speak about people who are night owls, I think that this is a relatively modern phenomenon, because I think that, for example, 200 years ago, and this is still largely true in peasant or agricultural societies, people usually go to bed relatively early and you're up at the crack of dawn, right? But when, in fact, there is light available 24 hours a day, how do our patterns of living change? Right? That's one interesting question that comes up. And so when we look at modernity and we look at the whole regime of modernization in particular, what we're saying is that lighting had all of these kinds of implications and consequences that we'd have to think about. How does it change the patterns of life? Right? And what does it mean to speak about the elimination of darkness? Because metaphorically we know, by the way, that there's a dread of darkness. All right? Now, public lighting had other virtues as well, or at least these were declared to be its great virtues. For example, one of the arguments that was made about how public lighting advanced public morals was that it would make it difficult for people engaging in nighttime activities that were illegal or nefarious to engage in them. Right? That was an argument that was made. And you know that there are always going to be groups of people, communities of people who are going to be engaging in nighttime activities. So this could be illicit smuggling, obviously prostitution would be one. And so there were all these arguments about the fact that lighting was a way of safeguarding public morals, right? It would shame those who were engaging in illicit activity at night. However, when we look at this, we have to really ask whether, and it's not a question of a trade-off here, we have to really ask whether, in fact, lighting also became another means of surveillance, right? So if you look at ordinary histories of technology, particularly lighting, those would really talk about the fact that now it became possible to run factories, for example, 24 hours a day, right? And that is very much the case, right? So you can look at it from that point of view. But I'm also interested in the fact that, in a sense, what it does is it actually increases the surveillance powers of the state. It increases the surveillance power of the capitalists, right? Those, I think, are quite interesting considerations, right? And I think that when you do a history of lighting, you should be attentive, as one would be in the case of other technologies, to what I'm describing as these kinds of cultural histories, okay? That, in other words, we have to move beyond the more evident aspects of lighting, such as illuminating a place, and so on and so forth, and then trying to look at its cultural and metaphorical aspects, all right? And final thought on this matter, because as I said, I'm going to be brief on this. What we have to think about also is, I mean, it's that remark that I'd given to you really about architecture. I think I'd mentioned it to you. I can't recall now. But there's this Japanese novelist His name is Tanizaki, who wrote a book in praise of shadows. And in this little book, one of the things he says is that when a Japanese architect is thinking about a building, about the design of a building, he thinks not only about how the building will look to a viewer, he thinks about the kind of shadows it will cast. Okay? And when we're thinking about lighting, we always have to think about shadows. I mean, so for those of you who are interested in black and white films, film noir, for example, the great fun of these films, among other things, is how they play around with the concept of light and shadows. And when we think about shadows, then we extend that metaphor, because then we have to think about areas of darkness and grayness. And when we think about that, in turn, we think about ambiguity. Right? What is the place of ambiguity in our thinking, in our civilization? And when I say that, what I'm referring to is, of course, the fact that I think that things become extremely polarized. Right? Remember when the September 11th bombings took place, and so the President of the United States at that time, George W. Bush, his pronouncement was, either you're with us or you're against us. Now, what's the place of ambiguity in this? What if you're neither with nor against? What if you thought that, well, there's something unjust about what's happened here, but there's also something unjust about the fact that large parts of the world are living under American domination? What if you thought that, for example? Right? Why should one happen to think that if you oppose American intervention, therefore you're some kind of lover or friend of Osama bin Laden? That idea is absurd. But when you put it in this fashion, either you're with us or you're against us, there's no room for shadows. Right? So you see how I think that when we think about these technologies, we have to really think beyond that object, and we have to extend its metaphorical reach. Because that is ultimately what makes this kind of work, it seems to me, interesting. All right? Now, the 19th century was a century not only of technologies of the kind that we've spoken about, it was a century of revolutions, which we have looked at, but we'll return to that in just 10 minutes when we turn to the Communist Manifesto, but it was also a century of ideologies. And I think we want to very briefly consider some of these ideologies to set the context for subsequent discussions as well. One of them is, of course, the ideology of Romanticism, which I have suggested to you. That is, that this was a reaction to industrialization, to the Industrial Revolution. Romanticism is not only that, it's a great many other things as well. It's about the elevation of the idea of affect, the idea of feeling, for example, right? That everything cannot be comprehended through the regime of reason. Right? It's not simply about, I mean, there is a crass way in which people simply think about Romanticism as something having to do with love. Well, that's not what the ideology of Romanticism is about. Romanticism as an ideology is something quite different, and it is an ideology. So, for example, Rousseau's whole idea that the child is innocent, the soul is innocent, and then what happens as you move along, you become corrupted by society, right? Now that, I'm giving it to you in a very crude form, but that's one aspect of the whole element of Romanticism. And one of the great Romantic poets, who was also an extraordinary artist, in fact, I would consider him one of the supreme geniuses in the history of humankind, is this man here, who drew this particular sketch, right? I don't know if anyone here recognizes this at all. This is an extraordinary masterwork of Western art. And this is William Blake, right? So William Blake is one of the 6 great English Romantic poets. You've got William Wordsworth, Blake, Coleridge, Shelley, Keats, Byron, right? And Blake was a person who was wholly opposed to the idea of the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, right? For a great many reasons. He was opposed in this particular artwork. What you see is the expression of his opposition to Newton's theory of optics. So there's another painting, and he has a little annotation to that. And the annotation, he says, and I'm quoting him, "Art is the tree of life. Science is the tree of death." Right? That's what he says. And of course, when you read him in that fashion, then you say, this is a man who is wholly opposed to the regime of science. Well, that may be one possible reading, but what he was really opposed to, what he thought was the mechanistic conception of science that had become predominant at that time, right? So Newton's theory of optics, this is his response to Newton's theory of optics. It's especially offensive to Blake because he makes a distinction between what he calls the vegetative eye. So the vegetative eye is what we all have when we look at the world in an ordinary fashion, and then what he called the spiritual vision, right? That is that you see with your eyes, and yet you see nothing very often, unless you have the gift of seeing in a different way, right? This idea of a deistic view of God, right, as a distinct creator who played no role in daily affairs, was something that was really repulsive to Blake. But he's not religious in the ordinary sense of the term. He's not one of these persons who goes to church every Sunday. That for him has nothing to do with religion, at all, right? But Blake is someone who claimed that he had these religious experiences or these visions of a spiritual nature, right? And he puts Newton alongside Francis Bacon and John Locke. So these are the three among the 5 or 6 really great heroes to emerge as the creators of modern society. He describes this as the trinity of evil, as it were, because from his point of view, these are the people who produced the kind of world in which we live today. That is a mechanistic conception of a world, right? A soulless conception of the world. And the question here is not whether you have to endorse it or not. We're simply trying to understand that this is what, in part, the ideology of Romanticism, meant, right? Then you have another predominant school of thought. And when I give names here, this is not to say that these are the only people who obviously represent that point of view. These are just sample names, right? The whole ideology of utilitarianism. Now, there are many ways to understand it. I remember when I was a philosophy student as an undergraduate more than 4 decades ago, we were given an example of what utilitarianism really meant. And so the example that the philosophers used to give was, let's supposing there are 10 people and they get shipwrecked on an island. And on that island, this is a barren island, there's nothing to do there, absolutely nothing to do there. And so 9 of those people who are shipwrecked happen to be sort of the sturdy types, and then you get one man who's a bit of a weakling, so the 9 pick on that one person. Now, according to the theory of utilitarianism, this would be perfectly justified. Why would it be justified? Because there's a formula through which utilitarianism was always explained. The greatest happiness of the greatest number. Whatever is conducive to the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So the happiness of these 9 completely outweighs the misery of that one person, and therefore this would justify this person being abused. Well, this is again a crass way, really, of really understanding utilitarianism, because when a utilitarian ideology was put into place, it meant something quite different. For example, India in the 1820s and the 1830s, the governor general was a man by the name of Bentham, and he was greatly influenced by utilitarian ideology. And what did that mean? It meant limited government, limited taxation, whatever tends to the greatest utility, particularly in affairs of the state. The state should do as little as possible, right? That's really what it translated into. But of course, the key word there is utility, that we have to look at the functional aspect of things, and that's how we assess what their value is. And you can understand that this would have been complete anathema to the Romantics, right? Because if you assess things only by their utility, then again we get what the Romantics would describe as a somewhat mechanistic conception of the world. Then we have various kinds of radicalism. I want to leave that aside for the moment because we're going to be turning to Marx and communism, and we're going to look at some other variations there as well. But I want to just briefly turn to liberalism over here, whose most well-known exponent, of course, was John Stuart Mill, the author of a very famous essay called On Liberty. He also wrote a number of other extremely important essays, including an essay on the subjection of women. He's not arguing for the subjection of women, let me assure you. He is arguing against the subjection of women, right? So he is very often seen as one of the earliest advocates, certainly among men, of the rights of women, if we want to use a very modern language, right? The rights of women and so on. In his essay on liberty, he's puts forward what becomes sort of some of the classical formulations of the idea of liberty, such as, for example, the formulation, putting it in very simple terms, that each person is entitled to his or her liberty so long as your exercise of your liberty does not encroach upon someone else's exercise of their liberty. Right? Because if you're going to make an argument about liberty, then you also have to be attentive to the limits of that. What might be the possible limits of liberty? Right? And that's what this essay was an exploration of. So the classic formulation of liberalism and the freedoms that we associate with that point of view, including the freedom of speech of expression, freedom of religious worship, freedom of association, so forth and so on, and what might be the possible limits of these freedom, this classic formulation is by John Stuart Mill. It must be said, however, at the same time, right? And there are some other works of his which are not as frequently read. But he also wrote a book called Considerations on Representative Government. And if you read this essay, what you find is that John Stuart Mill fundamentally took the view that liberty was really only for white people. You don't find this point of view in the essay called On Liberty so much as you do in his other works. And Mill certainly had very strong thoughts about that. Both he and his father had a lifelong association with India. Neither of them visited India. I think you might recall from my first lecture my invocation of his father, James Mill, who wrote this voluminous history of British India in 6 volumes. And I think some of you might now recall that I pointed out to you that what James Mill, who is also John Stuart Mill's father and the son, both of them together are also exponents of the idea of utilitarianism at the same time. But you may recall that I mentioned to you that James Mill pointed out that you can divide the history of India into 3 periods, and then I pointed out to you what I call the cunning of reason, that that he describes the ancient period as the Hindu period, the medieval period as the Mohammedan or Muslim period, but that he does not describe the modern period as a Christian period, even though India was under, you might say, in a fashion of speaking, under Christian rule. Right? So both James Mill and his son were employed by the East India Company. In fact, that's the only employment they ever really had. John Stuart Mill was a member of Parliament much later on for a very short period of time, but his principal employment was the East India Company. And what did he do at the East India Company? And I'm looking at it in slightly greater detail because you can sort of try to unravel the paradoxes of this man. Here's a great exponent of liberty. But how does he derive his living? He derives his living as an employee of the East India Company, where he writes 1,500 memorandums authorizing the annexation of Indian states. That's what he did. He was a person who was placed in charge of the policies having to do with how Indian states, native states, were gradually absorbed into British India. Right? He writes the documents authorizing the annexation. And of course, that shows you the failure at the heart of European liberalism. Right? That's, I think, what's important when you begin to look at somebody like John Stuart Mill. And then, moving on finally, before we turn to Marx, we have, of course, the ideas of Charles Darwin. So I'm going to discuss Africa later on, not today, maybe, most likely in the next lecture, and then we'll also look very briefly at this book that you have all been reading, Exterminate All the Brutes. Because there he talks about Darwin, and he talks about, obviously, such things as social Darwinism, and at least from the point of view of someone like myself and those who really look at human relations and try to understand the evolution of human societies, how Darwin's ideas became adopted by social scientists is actually of greater concern, which is where we get into the whole idea of social Darwinism. Because if you read the book, you know that there are all these European writers who effortlessly make the argument that there are groups of people who basically are not fit to live, they should be exterminated, right? Essentially, you should put them into museums. That's where they belong, right? And this is where we will get into the whole question of the museum complex and how did the museum idea of the museum arise, so forth and so on. But there were variations of this, of course, even before Darwin came about. So if you remember the theories of Robert Malthus, I mean, there is a form of social Darwinism over there as well, already, you know, before Darwin comes around to articulate his views, and then they get appropriated by people working in the domain of human society, people such as Herbert Spencer. And that's, if you recall my discussion of Robert Malthus, I pointed out that he has this idea of the survival of the fittest in some sense, right? That there is a struggle for existence. The growth of population will always outstrip the food supply that we have. We still hear arguments of this kind, by the way. There are variations of this still floating around. One shouldn't assume that these were only, you know, mid-19th century sort of theories which have completely disappeared, any more than eugenics, for example, has completely disappeared in our times. However, let me now turn to Marx. But before I do so, we need to just very briefly consider one more thing, which is what are called the revolutions of 1848. Right? All of Europe, nearly all of Europe, barring a few spots here and there, is going to be overrun by revolutions. We can spend a lot of time on each of these revolutions. If you look at these slides over here, so wherever you see these red spots over here, sort of like little flames, this is where the revolutions arose. Right? And then and again, there are different, you know, there are 50 different maps, and each of them will give you a little variant of how you might understand it. But you can see, you know, particularly in the Austrian Empire, places in Germany, northern Italy, not so much, but even down in Sicily here as well, but certainly in northern Italy, more industrial, by the way, than southern Italy, of course, and then portions of Germany, and even portions of Scandinavia over here. Yeah, these are all places where the revolutions arose. And how does one understand these revolutions? Well, essentially, these are all attempts by people to assert the rights that were stipulated in the French Revolution. Right? This would be the simplest way to really understand what these revolutions of 1848 signified. Right? Because you know, of course, if you think about what happened in the French Revolution, then there's a reaction. Right? And then you have the advent of Napoleon. So you have the reassertion of a monarchy, so to speak, in a way. Right? And the history of Europe in the middle 19th century is a history of this conflict of what you might describe as revolution, counter-revolution. And to cut a long story short, what's going to really happen is all of these revolutions are going to fail. That is, that they're going to lead to the restoration of the rights of kings. They're going to reverse the revolutions with respect to the idea of the liberty of people. Sometimes there were gains. For example, the idea of suffrage, the idea of universal suffrage. When I say universal suffrage here, I'm only referring to men. I'm not referring to the right extended to women to vote, because that's not available at any point here in the 19th century anywhere here in Europe. All right? So, but when I speak about universal suffrage here, what I'm referring to is diminishing property rights, or rather, if I may put it this way, diminishing the property qualification. Okay, that in order to vote you needed to have so much property, so forth and so on. That gradually, what's going to happen over a period of time is that this kind of qualification is going to diminish, so the number of men who are able to vote is going to continue to increase. Right, a larger percentage of working class men will gradually be able to vote. Sometimes there were gains of that sort in these revolutions of 1848, all right? But they arise out of, very briefly, they arise out of an immense dissatisfaction with the political leadership. They also arise out of demand for not simply rights in the ordinary sense of the term, but even such things as freedom of the press. Right? Because in many of these countries, the press could not be described as free at this point in time, if you're looking at the 1840s, 1850s, and moving into the 1860s. Right? In other words, this whole idea of self-determination, which is going to become, of course, exceedingly important as a platform for what is described as human rights, these revolutions of 1848 are really expressions of the right to self-determination. But as I said, by and large, they fail. Right? That's the context. Because Marx, when he emerges with the Communist Manifesto, right, this is going to be published in February 1848, and it's just a few weeks before the first of these revolutions in 1848. All right? That's the context in which Marx is fundamentally writing. Now, for the purposes of this class, we're not going to enter into distinctions between Marx and Engels. Many of the works are co-authored. There are very difficult questions about what portions of a work were written by Marx, what portions were written by Engels. But let's consider them as one. And so when I very often say Marx, I mean Marx and Engels, but there may be other contexts in which I mean really only Marx. All right? But that's something that we don't have the leisure to do, because I think you can imagine the scholarship on Marx and Engels and Marxism is a massive, massive industry. All right? Now, Marx is born in Trier in Germany in 1818. He dies in London in 1883. He is really a student of the French Revolution, by which I mean that he had studied the French Revolution and its implications of what came out of it very, very closely. Because the interesting question from the point of view of intellectual history is, what do each of them bring to their enterprise as a whole? Right? And so this is what I'm simply doing here, is that's what I mean. I'm delineating that this is what he knew best, and then he had pondered the French Revolution and its implications, read up on the literature. His compatriot, Engels, who's a little bit younger, also born in Germany in 1820. He outlives Marx, however, by 12 years, because he dies in 1895. Both of them died in London. And of course, they had moved to London circa about 1850, I think it was 1849 or 1850. In fact, I recall when I first went to London, I went to the British Museum. At those times, if you visited the British Museum and the British Library were one institution, right? You could separate them by name, but they were one institution. And if you went there, there was this chair, and the guide would always point to the chair where Marx used to sit for decades, right? And many people have, of course, reflected on the great irony of this man sitting in the great citadel of Western learning and trying to basically unmake the West, if I may put it this way, from his position there. But both of them lived in London for the last several decades, and London was undoubtedly at that point the financial and commercial capital of Europe. I mean, there were other important cities, needless to say, but London definitely, because the English were the greatest imperial power of the 19th century. What Engels brings to this enterprise is a profound understanding, a deep study of the English working class. Right? So each of them brought something. There were many other things as well, but if you had to pick one thing that they brought. Now the Communist Manifesto, as I've already pointed out to you, is published in February 1848. It goes through many editions, by the 1870s, 1880s. So in fact, actually, its history is very complicated. I mean, if you want to read some of that, you can read the long introductions. There are hundreds of available editions. One that I use quite often is published by Verso Books with an introduction by Eric Hobsbawm, an English social historian, where he points out, gives you a short history of how this text moved around, how it was translated, all of which is an interesting part of the intellectual history of this text. All right. However, there are a few things that I think we should be aware of, which are really more germane than anything else. Beginning first with some minor details, and then moving to some larger questions about what Marx is really saying, and what might be some larger aspects of Marx's thinking. It's written in German, and the maximum number of editions, of course, by the late 19th century, moving into the 20th century, were in Russian. And particularly, of course, after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the editions in Russian really multiplied. You can imagine moving into the 1920s, editions in Chinese, for example, also come to the fore. But there are editions in virtually every language. The English edition is really based on the 1872 German edition. Okay? And if you had to read one preface, you should read Engels' preface to the 1888 English edition based on the German edition of 1872. Now there's a question about what place it occupies in Marx's writings. Okay, and you have to keep in mind, of course, that this is part of a pamphlet literature. It really is a pamphlet, right? Because the actual text is only 40 pages. And that's how it was circulated. And I think this is important because pamphlets are things that you can put into your pocket. You know, you're a worker, you can put it in your overalls. Its dissemination is much easier. It's much easier, and of course it's available at a very cheap price. Though those are all the reasons why pamphlets proliferated. All right? And pamphlets have an extraordinary place, as I think I pointed out in passing to you once before, in the history of the emergence of what we might describe as modernity. With particular reference to Marx's writings, the Communist Manifesto is undoubtedly the most well-known work, right, for a general audience, And when we think of Marx, typically what scholars do is they basically divide Marx into what you might describe as three phases. So there's the early Marx, and that's a Marx of what is called the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, and then a book called the German Ideology, 1845. Now, the early Marx can be viewed as a humanist, right? I mean, many people are amazed to hear that. I don't know how many of you here heard the speech by Mr. Trump last night, State of the Union address, and that very firm affirmation by him that we will never be a socialist country, God forbid, because we were born in freedom and will die in freedom, and socialism is the greatest evil in the world. These are his words, not my words, right? We will never be a socialist country. Well, he, of course, has no inkling of the fact that there is a humanist Marx, right? Because all he knows is something called communism and people butcher each other. That's about the level that you're going to get, obviously, right? But there is a humanist Marx who has appealed to people who do not subscribe to the theory and doctrines of communism. Because when you read that early Marx, you get the sense of someone who is inflamed by the idea of injustice, right? Who has, in fact, some of that romanticism about him, actually. That's the humanist, young humanist Marx, who looks at the world around him and sees the enormous inequality and is repulsed by it, right? And you don't have to go with any specific doctrine at that point in time to understand, if I may put it this way, the young humanist Marx. Then there is a classical Marx, the Marx of the Marxists, so to speak. So that's the Marx of Kapital or Das Kapital, 3 volumes of that. Right? And this is where you get the classical exposition of Marxian economics. And then you get the later Marx, and that's a very long history because that's the appropriation by different Marxist groups of Marxist thinking, including, for example, the Italian autonomist tradition of Marxian thinking, which has a very different take on how to understand it. None of that is really critically important from really your standpoint, but it's a way to understand that the Communist Manifesto does not squarely belong within this way of thinking. A, because it is intended as a polemical work, where he had not fully thought out his economics, although he had pretty much thought out his conception of history. So you should read it largely as a historical treatise, as a treatise on Marx's conception of history, not as a treatise on Marxian economics. All right? That's what I'm really trying to impress upon you. And then, of course, there is the question that there are things in it which are obviously dated, things that are ephemeral and contingent. In other words, things that he was saying which made sense at that time and which really are completely opaque today. So you have to sift that out and get to really the main portion. So when he says a specter is haunting Europe, and that, by the way, is a rhetorical power. I mean, who can forget that line? Or when he says all that is solid melts into air, right? It's that enormous rhetorical power. It's almost biblical, the way in which he was able to put forward certain kinds of propositions. So as I'm going to argue for you, if you look over here, I say that it's a work that is apodictic, by which I mean, so apodictic goes back to Aristotle and his conception of logic, but apodictic means that it's basically irrefutable. These are very, very short paragraphs. He puts them forward as propositions, right? And of course, he's not offering evidence, right? There are no footnotes, thank God, because this is a pamphlet, right? So it has that apodictic thrust, this rhetorical flourish. And yet the interesting thing is that there is a real substantive argument there, right? So when I say the last point here, that it's ephemeral and contingent, I mean by that when he says all the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter, Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot. I mean, who even remembers Metternich and Guizot unless you're some kind of historian of Europe who keeps on reading these figures every day, right? All of this has disappeared. This is really of no consequence. And so in that sense, there are portions of it which are clearly dated, but we have to understand what is really enduring in this particular text. So as I pointed out to you, it is more a historical work rather than an economic treatise. It has a rhetorical power and an apodictic thrust. Now, what is his interest? His interest is in part to display the historical development of bourgeois society, its revolutionary character. And the minute I say its revolutionary character, some of you might say, well, that's very odd because isn't the bourgeoisie part of the oppressive structure? Of course it is. But it played a revolutionary role, just as what Marx explained the English did in India, right? Because if you follow the Marxist conception of history and historical materialism, you have to go through various stages. So the bourgeoisie had the role of energizing that society. it has a certain impact, but it will eventually be superseded. It will eventually be superseded. So his ambition here is to explain, in the first instance, what is the historical development of this bourgeois society, and what is the materialist conception of history. Now what I want to do is I want to just very briefly go through Marx's ideas, some of them, very, very briefly, okay? Because Marx has this conception of what he calls the mode of production, all right? So there is, for example, the capitalist mode of production, right? And that's the mode of production that he's most interested in, after he has explained in some of his works the earlier modes of production, beginning with what he calls the Asiatic mode of production, and then obviously the feudal mode of production, and then you get to, of course, the capitalist mode of production. What is a mode of production? It is made up of what he calls productive forces plus the relations of production. That is the unity of these productive forces, or forces of production, if you want to use that phrase. And what are these forces of production? It includes the means of production. So the means of production would include tools, machinery, land, infrastructure, and, of course, human labor power. Right? All of these are what he calls the forces of production. These forces of production, in unity with the relations of production. The relations of production are the relations that you enter into. Some of these relations you're born into, and to that extent, they are involuntary. For example, you have a relation with your parents because you're born into that relation. Right? And then there are other relations that may be involuntary. So for example, if you're born in this country, right, then you become an American citizen by definition. So you have a relation with the nation. But then there are, of course, other relations that you enter into voluntarily. When, for example, you seek to sell your labor. Right? When you seek to sell your labor to someone, that's a relation that you're entering into. You know? All right? So for Marx, a mode of production is comprised of what he describes as social relations and their unity with the forces of production. So let me just read out something I've written to you, and you want to see if you can understand the logic of it, because I've tried to summarize it very briefly. That production begins with the development of its determinative aspect, that is the productive forces, which once they have reached a certain level, come into conflict with the relations of production within which they have been developing. This leads to an inevitable change in the relations of production, since in the obsolete form they cease to be indispensable condition of the production process. In its turn, the change in the relations of production, which means the substitution of the new economic basis for the old one, so for example, the substitution of a capitalist mode of production for a pre-capitalist mode of production, leads to more or less rapid change in the entire society. And this is where, by the way, we get into a distinction that has been one of the cornerstones of a kind of an orthodox way of thinking about Marxian economics. And what is that cornerstone? The distinction between base and superstructure. If I have to translate it into a different language, very simply, what would that mean? What it means is that according to Marx, in the orthodox conception of this, okay, the conventional conception of it, the base of a society is determined by its mode of production. Everything else is the superstructure, including the legal systems, the art, the music, the culture. So in a capitalist society, that economic base will determine the superstructure. That is, that a bourgeois society will on the whole produce a certain kind of art. a society that has a bourgeois economic conception of itself will produce legal systems that conform to that. That's the superstructure. That reflects the base. So for him, the base was, as I said, this is kind of the old-fashioned sort of orthodox conception of the relationship between base and superstructure. All right? And of course, there are a number of other concepts that Marx develops. And as I pointed out to you, we're not really looking at this as a kind of an economic treatise, but there is a notion of alienation, exploitation, wage labor, surplus value. Let's just look at the last one, and I'll stop with that for today. Okay? What does Marx mean when he talks about surplus value? What is his theory of surplus value? I'll give you two different ways to look at it, both of which I think are exceedingly simple, and of course there's, again, a big discussion on it, but this is one way to think about it. What is surplus value? It is a difference between the amount raised through the sale of a product and the amount it cost to the owner of that product to manufacture it. Right? That's Marx's theory of surplus value. Or if you look at it a different way, it's value created by workers in excess of their labor cost. So the labor cost includes not only the wages you pay to the person, but the cost of the material. Right? That's part of the labor cost. So surplus value is a value created by workers in excess of the labor cost, which is then appropriated by the capitalist as profit. So if the labor cost was X, and then the surplus would be the X plus 1, whatever is left over. Right? And that, of course, becomes the profits of the capitalist. Right? All right, so we're going to have to stop here. We're going to spend a few more minutes maybe on this, perhaps, and then we're going to move on to the next segment.